Hello, dear listeners. She was just a young woman working hard to achieve her dreams, never imagining that by accepting that job at one of the country's largest companies, her life would change forever. Today, I'm going to share with you a story that proves true. Love can be born in the most unexpected moments. If you believe that great transformations can happen when we least expect them, stay until the end. This story might be exactly what your heart needs to hear today. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe for more stories that touch the soul and restore our faith in true love. Emily Carter nervously clutched the strap of her faux leather purse as she gazed at the imposing glass and steel building that rose before her like a monument to power, and Money Sterling Enterprises occupied the top 15 floors of that tower in Manhattan's business district, and she was about to go up to the 30th floor for an interview that could change her life forever. The reflection in the mirrored glass of the lobby showed a 24-year-old woman trying to look more confident than she really felt. Her brown hair was perfectly styled. The navy blue blazer she had bought on sale last month did a good job of hiding the nervousness that made her hands tremble slightly. The daughter of a retired school teacher from a small town in Ohio, Emily had grown up in a house where money was always tight. Her mother, Helen, had worked for 2 decades in public schools and now lived on a pension that barely covered the basic bills from a young age. Emily learned that big dreams required even bigger efforts, and that nothing in life would be given for free. She had studied business at Ohio State University, working weekends as a saleswoman in a clothing store to pay her expenses, and had even managed to learn fluent Spanish by watching subtitled shows and taking free online courses. The elevator ascended silently through the floors, and with each number that appeared on the digital display, Emily felt her heart beat faster. When the doors opened on the 30th floor, she was greeted by an environment that seemed straight out of a design magazine. Carrara marble floors, Italian designer, furniture paintings that probably cost more than she earned in a year, and a breathtaking panoramic view of Manhattan. The receptionist, a stylish middle-aged woman, smiled politely, but with that professional coldness that made it clear she didn't belong in that world. Miss Emily Carter. The secretary checked an electronic schedule. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you. Please follow me." Emily followed her down the wide corridor, her steps muffled by the plush carpet that covered the entire floor. The walls were decorated with photos of the group's ventures, luxury hotels, shopping centers, residential condominiums that housed New York's elite. Each image was a reminder of the power and influence of the man she was about to meet as she walked. Emily tried to remember everything she had researched about Alexander Sterling in the past few days. 42 years old, heir to a family empire that began with small businesses in the Midwest and had transformed into one of the country's largest fortunes. Single. No known children, known for his reserved personality and the perfectionism he applied to both his business dealings and his personal life. The door to the main office opened, revealing an even more impressive space. A room the size of the entire apartment where Emily lived with her mother. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the city. A solid mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, flanked by genuine leather armchairs that looked more comfortable than any bed she had ever slept on. But it was the man with his back to her, talking on the phone, that made Emily momentarily forget to breathe. Alexander. Sterling was tall and imposing, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled out his Italian-tailored suit. His dark hair had a few silver strands at the temples that only accentuated his natural authority. When he turned to greet her, after ending the call, Emily felt as if the air in the room had become denser. His eyes were a deep brown that seemed capable of reading thoughts, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made people feel simultaneously important and vulnerable. He was handsome in a way that was intimidating. Not the obvious good looks of a movie star, but something more subtle and dangerous. A combination of power, intelligence, and charisma that explained why he was considered one of the country's most eligible bachelors. "Miss Carter, please have a seat." His voice was deep and polite, but carried a tone of command that brooked no argument. Emily obeyed, crossing her legs and maintaining the straight posture her mother had always insisted showed confidence and self-respect. Alexander settled into the armchair opposite her, and for a few seconds studied her resume without saying a word. The silence stretched until she began to wonder if she had made a mistake. But then he looked up and analyzed her with the same intensity with which he had read her personal data business degree from Ohio State. Fluent in Spanish experience in sales and customer service, he recited without looking at the paper. "You've always lived in Ohio until you moved to New York 6 months ago in search of better professional opportunities, correct?" Emily confirmed, trying not to show how his presence affected her. "Yes, sir, that's right." He tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating not just her qualifications, but her personality. "Tell me, why would a young woman from the Midwest leave the security of her hometown to try her luck in New York City with no guarantees?" The question was direct, blunt, and Emily realized this was a test not just of her professional skills, but of her determination and courage. She took a deep breath and decided on total honesty. "Because, Mr. Sterling, I believe that big dreams require big risks," she said, with a firmness that surprised even herself. "I could have stayed in Ohio working in some local business, earning a modest salary, and living a predictable life. But I've always known I was capable of more than that. My mother taught me that we can't blame our circumstances for our mediocrity if we never try to change those circumstances." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the answer. "And what makes you think you're prepared to work in an environment like this, where decisions involve millions of dollars, and where one mistake can cost jobs and contracts? Because I learned early on that responsibility isn't about the amount of money involved, but about the seriousness with which we treat our commitments," Emily replied, leaning slightly forward. "My mother managed our family's $1,500 a month budget with the same dedication I imagine you devote to your billions. The difference is in the number of zeros, not in the importance of the necessary care." The silence that followed was different this time. Alexander watched her with genuine interest, as if she had just said something he hadn't expected to hear. "Tell me about your salary expectations," he said finally. Emily had rehearsed that answer for days, researched market values, talked to college friends working in large companies. She mentioned a figure she considered fair, but not exorbitant, expecting the negotiation that usually followed such a question. To her surprise, he immediately agreed. "I agree with the figure, but I need to make it clear that working directly with me requires total availability, constant travel meetings that can extend into the early hours, weekends when necessary, and above all, absolute discretion about everything you see or hear related to the company's business." He paused, as if measuring the impact of his words. "I'm not an easy boss. Miss Carter, I have high standards for both myself and my team, and I don't tolerate mediocrity, incompetence, or lack of commitment. Are you prepared for that level of demand?" Emily looked directly into his eyes without flinching. "Yes, I am, Mr. Sterling, and, in fact, I prefer it that way. I believe exceptional people only develop in environments that constantly challenge them. If you expected less of me, I would be disappointed, because it would mean you didn't see the potential in me, that I know I have something that could have been." An almost smile crossed Alexander's lips, as if she had just passed a test he gave to all candidates, but from which few emerged successfully. "Very well. You'll start on Monday at 8 a.m. sharp. Your main responsibility will be to accompany me to meetings, organizing documents, providing translations when necessary, and handling the logistics of domestic and international travel. You will also be responsible for screening calls and correspondence, ensuring I only have access to what truly requires my personal attention." He stood up, indicating the interview was over. "My secretary will give you all the details about benefits, necessary paperwork, and instructions for your first day. Welcome to the team, Miss Carter." Emily stood as well, extending her hand professionally. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Sterling. I promise you won't regret your decision." When he shook her hand, she felt an electric shock that ran up her entire arm. It was just a formal handshake, but there was something in the way his fingers wrapped around hers that made her heart race dangerously. He also seemed to have felt something because his eyes lingered on hers for a second longer before he released her hand. "I'm sure it will be a productive partnership," he said. And there was something in the way he pronounced the word partnership that made Emily wonder if he was referring to more than just work. Leaving that office, Emily felt her legs go weak and her heart still racing. She had gotten the job of her dreams, but something told her she had just entered unknown and dangerous territory. On the elevator ride down 30 floors, she tried to process everything that had happened, the intensity of Alexander's gaze, the way he seemed to see through any mask or pretense, the power that emanated from his every gesture, every word. This man was different from anyone she had ever known. There was something magnetic about him, but also something that warned her that working so closely with him would be a much bigger challenge than simply performing administrative tasks that night. In her small, one-bedroom apartment in Queens, Emily called her mother in Ohio and told her about the interview. As always, Helen listened attentively, asking practical questions about salary benefits and growth prospects. But when Emily vaguely mentioned that her new boss seemed to be an interesting person, her mother immediately picked up on something in her daughter's tone of voice. "Be careful, Emily," Helen said, with the wisdom of someone who had lived long enough to recognize danger. "Signs powerful men are often charming, but they're rarely trustworthy, especially with young, beautiful women like you, Mom." "It's nothing like that," Emily protested. "It's just a job, and he's completely professional." But even as she said it, she remembered the way Alexander had held her hand a second longer than necessary. The intensity in his eyes when he said it would be a productive partnership over the weekend. She obsessively researched Alexander Sterling online. She found articles in business magazines, photos at social events, always alone or accompanied by different, elegant women. But apparently with no serious relationship, she discovered he had lost his parents in a car accident when he was 25, prematurely inheriting control of the family business. She read about his reputation as a ruthless negotiator, his preference for working long hours, his perfectionism that bordered on obsession, and also about the rumors that he was extremely private about his personal life, never giving interviews on matters that weren't strictly professional. There was something mysterious about him that piqued Emily's curiosity, in a way she knew was dangerous for a newly hired employee. On Monday at 7:45 a.m., said she was in the building's lobby, wearing a conservative navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a briefcase with documents organized alphabetically. When she reached the 30th floor, she found her desk was in an anteroom directly connected to Alexander's office, from where she could see him working. When the door was open, he was already there, despite the early hour, impeccably dressed, talking on the phone in English, with someone who, from the tone of the conversation, seemed to be an international investor. His voice was firm and controlled as he discussed figures that made Emily's head spin, millions of dollars spoken of, as if they were cents contracts that could change the fate of entire cities, decided. During a 15-minute call, "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said. When he ended the call and noticed her arrival, "Punctuality is a virtue I value highly." "Good morning, Mr. Sterling," she replied professionally. "I hope we can establish a productive work routine during the first week." Alexander kept her busy with tasks that tested both her competence and her adaptability. Organizing meetings with executives from other companies, translating complex contracts from Spanish to English, researching detailed information about potential business partners, and handling logistical details that required absolute precision. Emily quickly discovered that he hadn't exaggerated about his high standards. Any mistake, no matter how small, was immediately pointed out and corrected, not with rudeness, but with a firmness that made it clear that mediocrity would not be tolerated at the same time. She noticed that when the work was done correctly, he acknowledged the effort with a nod of approval or a positive comment that was worth more than any exaggerated praise. What impressed her most was the way he treated all employees with respect, from the senior executives to the cleaning staff. There was a natural authority in him that made people want to do their best, not out of fear, but out of admiration at the end of the first week when he simply said, "Very well. Miss Carter, you're adapting adequately." Emily felt a professional satisfaction she had never experienced before. It was as if she had been accepted into an exclusive club where only the best could remain. But as the days went by, she began to notice things about Alexander that went beyond the professional persona. The way he would close his eyes for a few seconds, when he thought no one was looking, as if carrying an invisible weight, how his hands moved. With almost artistic precision, when he leafed through documents, the way he watched the city from the window, during long calls with an expression she couldn't decipher. There were moments when she would catch his gaze on her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Glances that lasted a little longer than would be appropriate between a boss and an employee. And that made her heart race inconveniently one Thursday afternoon, when an important meeting was canceled at the last minute. They found themselves alone in the office. For the first time since the job interview, Alexander was standing by the window watching the city's slow traffic while Emily organized documents at her desk. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but there was a tension in the air she couldn't ignore. "May I ask you a question, Mr. Sterling?" she finally said. "Breaking the silence that depends on the question," he replied, without turning around. "Why did you choose my application?" There were dozens of more qualified people with experience in big companies. Why a young woman from the Midwest with no significant corporate history? Now, he turned and looked at her directly. "Do you want the politically correct answer, or the honest one? The honest one always, because you reminded me of myself." When I started, he walked over to the armchair in front of her desk and sat down in a more relaxed posture than she was used to seeing when I took over the family business. At 25, everyone doubted my ability. I was too young, too inexperienced, too emotional to run an empire that my father and grandfather had taken decades to build. Everyone expected me to fail, to squander the family inheritance. In a few years, there was a subtle bitterness in his voice, as if those memories still hurt. "And how did you prove them wrong? By working 20 hours a day, studying every aspect of the business, making mistakes, and learning from them. Never allowing myself the luxury of mediocrity or self-pity." He paused. "When I saw your determination in the interview, I recognized that same hunger to prove your own worth. It's a powerful feeling, Miss Carter. It can lead us to extraordinary achievements or destroy us completely, depending on how we channel it." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something intense, almost intimate, in the way he was sharing that part of his story. "And which path am I taking?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "That is yet to be determined," he replied with a faint smile. "But so far I'm impressed. With your dedication and intelligence." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of documents that needed immediate attention. But Emily couldn't forget the conversation for the rest of the day. There was something in the vulnerability Alexander had shown when talking about the start of his career that made her see him as more than just a millionaire boss. He too had been young, insecure, seeking approval. He too had carried the weight of expectations that seemed impossible to meet that night at home. She found herself thinking about him in a way she knew was inappropriate. 2 weeks later, the first business trip arrived, a meeting in the Hamptons with investors interested in developing a luxury resort in the area. Alexander explained it would be just a one-day trip, a round trip by helicopter to optimize time. But when Emily heard the word helicopter, she felt her stomach clench. She had never flown, not even in a plane, and the prospect of her first aerial experience being in a small aircraft made her nervous on the morning of the trip. She arrived at the heliport on the East River 15 minutes before the scheduled time. Wearing a beige blazer and a skirt, she considered appropriate for important meetings. Alexander arrived punctually at 7, driving a black sports car that probably cost more than she would earn in 5 years. He greeted the pilot in English, checked the weather conditions, and only then noticed the tense expression on Emily's face. "First time in a helicopter?" he asked, observing how she looked at the aircraft with a mixture of fascination and apprehension. "First time flying," she confessed, trying to smile to hide her nervousness. "But I'm ready for the experience." He studied her for a moment, then said something to the pilot in a low voice that she couldn't hear. During takeoff, Emily gripped the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. But as they gained altitude and the view of the Long Island Sound revealed itself in all its majesty, she completely forgot her fear. It was absolutely stunning. Green wooded coastlines dipping into sparkling water islands, scattered like green jewels on the infinite blue of the ocean. Deserted beaches that looked like movie sets. "Look there." Alexander pointed to a peninsula covered in lush vegetation that will be the location of the resort-exclusive access by boat or helicopter, a privileged view of the entire coast. Emily leaned over to get a better look, and for a moment their shoulders touched. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent an electric shock through her body. She quickly pulled away, pretending to adjust her seatbelt, but noticed that Alexander had also felt something, because his eyes lingered on her for a few seconds, before turning back to the landscape below. It was then that the pilot began to speak rapidly in English, checking instruments with a worried expression. "What's the problem?" Alexander asked in English. "Engine trouble," the pilot replied. Sweat beginning to appear on his forehead. "Hydraulic failure. I need to find a place to land immediately." Emily felt panic rise in her throat like a wave as the helicopter began to vibrate irregularly. It wasn't the normal vibration of flight. It was something wrong, frightening, that made the whole machine shudder. "How much time do we have?" Alexander asked, his voice controlled, but filled with an urgency she had never heard before. "Minutes, maybe less," the pilot answered, maneuvering desperately towards a small island in the middle of the ocean. Emily looked down and saw only blue water stretching out, infinitely punctuated by tiny pieces of land that looked like dots on a map. The island they were heading for was covered in vegetation, but looked dangerously small for an emergency landing. She grabbed Alexander's arm without thinking and felt him cover her hand with his own in an instinctive gesture of protection. "Look at me," he said, forcing her to meet his eyes. "We're going to get through this." For a crazy moment, she believed him completely. The helicopter spiraled downwards, losing altitude rapidly as the pilot desperately tried to reach the small island's beach. The engine made noises that didn't sound normal, and smoke started to pour from somewhere Emily couldn't identify. She closed her eyes and held on to Alexander's hand, as if it were the only real thing in the world, feeling him squeeze her fingers back, trying to convey a security that neither of them really felt. The impact came, like a thunderclap, twisting metal, shattering glass, the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, and then complete darkness. When Emily regained consciousness, she was upside down, held by the seat belt, with pain radiating from places she didn't even know existed in her body. The silence was deafening after the hellish noise of the crash. Only the distant sound of the waves and the occasional crackle of cooling metal. Emily Alexander's voice cut through the silence, filled with urgency and relief. "I'm here," she answered, her voice hoarse, discovering she could speak. "Are you hurt?" she did a quick mental inventory of her body pain. Yes, a lot of pain, but nothing that seemed to indicate serious injuries, I don't think so. And you alive, he replied, and she heard the sound of him moving, trying to free himself from the wreckage. He managed to get out of the overturned aircraft, crawling onto the sand of the beach. The helicopter was unrecognizable, scattered across the area like a broken toy smoke, rising from what was left of the engine. Alexander emerged from the other side of the wreckage with blood running from a cut on his forehead, but on his feet, clearly alive. It was then that they both saw the pilot and understood in silence that they were alone. The reality of the situation hit them like a cold wave. They were stranded on a seemingly deserted island with no radio, no way to communicate, and no one knowing exactly where they had crashed. The sun was high, indicating midday, but there was no sign of human life anywhere, only dense vegetation, a few palm trees and volcanic rocks that suggested the island's ancient origin. "Where are we?" Emily asked. Although she knew he would have no more answers than she did. "I don't know," he admitted. And for the first time since she'd met him, Alexander Sterling seemed genuinely uncertain. "But we'll figure it out, and we'll find a way out of here." Emily looked around the island, which didn't seem to be more than a few hundred yards long. She looked at the smoldering wreckage that had been their only means of transport back to civilization. She felt the hot, midday sun that would soon turn into the cold of a coastal night, and realized that her life had changed dramatically in a matter of minutes. She was no longer worried about meetings or impressing her boss. Now her only concern was survival, and for the first time since she started working for Alexander, she saw him not as the powerful businessman who commanded an empire, but as a man, as lost and vulnerable as she was, for some reason, that reassured her they were in the same situation facing the same danger, and they would have to rely on each other in a way that went far beyond any professional relationship they had ever experienced, looking at his face stained with blood but determined. Emily felt that perhaps this deserted island was where they would discover who they really were, when all social masks and pretenses were stripped away by the most basic of instincts. The need to survive the first few hours on the island were a blur of pain, shock, and the gradual acceptance of a reality that seemed impossible. Emily sat on the sand, still warm from the midday sun, hugging her knees and trying to process that this was not a nightmare she would wake up from in her apartment in New York. The salty taste of blood in her mouth, mixed with the salt from the sea air, was too real to be imagination. Alexander had moved away to examine the helicopter wreckage, looking for anything that might be useful for survival. But she could see from his body language that the news was not good when he returned. He was carrying a half-full bottle of water, 2 packs of crackers they found in the pilot's luggage, and a grim expression. "Will someone come looking for us?" Emily asked, and the question came out more desperate than she intended. "The registered flight plan indicates our general route." Alexander sat on the sand beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "But when we don't return as scheduled, they'll start a search. The problem is this island wasn't on our original route. We diverted because of the emergency, so it could take time to find us." How much time, she pressed? Days, weeks? He didn't answer because he didn't know. And for the first time in his life, his international contacts and financial power were absolutely useless. Thirst came first, as a discomfort, then evolving into an urgent need that dominated all other thoughts. Emily hadn't had water since breakfast, and the sun was drawing every drop of moisture from her body. Her lips began to chap, and her mouth felt dry as cotton. "We need to find fresh water," she said, standing up, despite the dizziness that made her sway slightly. Alexander stood up, too, more slowly, clearly still feeling the effects of the crash. "I'll explore the island," he announced. "I'll try to find a spring, or at least rainwater collected somewhere." "No." Emily shook her head. "Let's go together. If one of us gets hurt or lost, the other needs to know Where they are. He looked at her surprised, as if he wasn't used to having his decisions questioned, especially by an employee. But after a moment he nodded in agreement. You're right. Right now. We're a team. The word team sounded strange coming from him. Always so used to commanding alone. But there was something comforting in the way he included her as a partner in survival rather than a protected person to be cared for. They explored the small island methodically. Discovering it was about 400 yards long by 200 wide with vegetation, typical of the East Coast. Small trees, some berry bushes that Emily couldn't identify, volcanic rocks suggesting an ancient origin, and at the highest point a small elevation of perhaps 30 feet. There was a natural depression in the rock that collected rainwater. It wasn't much, but it would be enough for a few days if they rationed carefully. They also found some fruits that looked edible, small and sweet, growing on low bushes. Emily remembered a survival documentary she had watched as a child and suggested they test small amounts first to make sure they weren't poisonous, while Alexander collected water from the rock depression, using a large leaf as a makeshift funnel. Emily couldn't help but notice how he had changed in the few hours since the crash. His posture was still confident, but there was a new humility in his movements, as if he was learning that physical strength and practical skills were as important as financial intelligence. His movements were careful, precise, but clearly outside his usual comfort zone. This man who commanded multi-million-dollar meetings was now crouched in the dirt trying to capture drops of water like any desperate person would. "How do you know these things?" he asked, when she explained how to use palm fronds to make makeshift ropes. "Documentaries? Books? Curiosity?" Emily replied, not stopping her work. "My mom always said that knowledge never takes up space, and you never know when a seemingly useless piece of information might save your life." "I guess she was right." "Wise woman, your mother," Alexander commented, and there was something genuinely respectful in the way he said it. Not the condescending tone she sometimes heard from upper-class people. Talking about the less privileged, it was a real recognition of wisdom and value as the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and red. The temperature began to drop more rapidly than Emily had anticipated without the protection of buildings or heating. She realized how vulnerable the human body was to the natural elements. "We need shelter," Alexander said. Looking around the island, "It's going to get very cold." During the night, they worked together collecting fallen branches, large palm leaves, and any material that could offer protection from the wind and night dampness. Emily found that her hands were easily scraped by the rough branches, but she kept working, aware that comfort was a luxury they couldn't afford. Alexander tried to help, but it was obvious that manual labor was not his forte. His hands were used to holding pens and shaking hands on deals, not tying branches or weaving leaves. However, he followed her instructions without question, a role reversal that would have been unthinkable in the office. "You're doing well for an executive," Emily commented, trying to ease the tension with a bit of humor. "Thank you," he replied, with a tired smile. "I think it's the first time in my life someone has given me instructions on physical labor, and I'm finding it's more humbling than I imagined." "It's not humbling." Emily stopped working and looked at him directly. "It's just different. You spend your whole life developing certain skills, and now you need to learn others that doesn't diminish what you already know. It just expands who you are." There was something vulnerable in his expression, as if she had touched a wound he rarely exposed. "Ever since I took over the family business," he said, returning to his work, "I've always had to be the expert, the one who knew all the answers. It's strange to admit that I have no idea what I'm doing." "Welcome to the club," Emily replied, with a genuine smile. "I have no idea what I'm doing either. I'm improvising based on things I've read or seen, but at least we're improvising together." When they finished the makeshift shelter, the sun had completely disappeared, and the stars began to appear with an intensity Emily had never seen in New York without light pollution. The night sky seemed infinite, filled with points of light creating mesmerizing patterns. "It's beautiful," she murmured, looking up under different circumstances. "It would be romantic." Alexander agreed, following her gaze. "But now, it's just a reminder of how small and lost we are." They settled into the cramped shelter, forced to sit close to each other. To conserve body heat, the temperature had dropped considerably, and their clothes, still damp from the crash, didn't offer much insulation. Emily shivered involuntarily, and without hesitation, Alexander took off his blood and sand-stained blazer, offering it to her. "You'll get cold," she protested, but he was already placing the fabric over her shoulders. "I'll be fine," he said, but she could see that he was shivering too. "We can share," she suggested, unable to look directly at him. "Body heat is more efficient when shared." The suggestion hung in the air between them, charged with a tension neither of them knew how to navigate. They were a boss and an employee trapped in a life-or-death situation where normal social rules no longer applied, but still there were invisible boundaries that neither wanted to cross hastily. Alexander hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You're sure you don't mind the proximity?" he replied. She tried to sound practical, when in reality her heart was racing dangerously. It's just survival. They lay side by side in the confined space of the shelter, using his blazer as a makeshift blanket. The ground was hard, uncomfortable, but the warmth radiating from his body was comforting in a way that went beyond the physical. There was something profoundly human about sharing body heat, something primitive and honest that cut through all social pretenses. Emily could feel his breath against her hair, the scent of his skin mixed with salt and sweat, a masculine fragrance that was strangely calming. "Emily." His voice was low, intimate in the darkness. "Thank you for today, for knowing what to do, for not panicking." She didn't answer immediately, processing how strange it was to hear genuine gratitude from a man who was used to having all the solutions. "You don't have to thank me," she finally whispered. "We both did what needed to be done." He moved slightly, and she felt his arm position itself protectively behind her head. Not as a romantic advance, but as an instinctive gesture of care. "I've never been in a situation like this," he admitted. "I've never felt so completely out of control, me neither," she replied honestly. "But sometimes losing control is the only way to find out what we're really capable of." They fell silent, listening to the night sounds of the island. Small animals moving in the vegetation, the constant sound of waves crashing on the shore, insects chirping in choruses that rose and fell like natural music. It was a world completely different from the urban environment where they had both spent their adult lives. More primitive, more immediate, more real in many ways. "Are you scared?" Alexander asked, after a long silence. Emily considered lying, maintaining the facade of courage she had built during the day. But the darkness and proximity seemed to demand honesty. "Yes," she admitted. "I'm scared that no one will find us, that we won't know how to survive long enough, that we'll make some fatal mistake." She paused. "And you? I'm scared too," he confessed, and there was something liberating in the admission, scared of failing, of not being able to get us out of here, of all my experience and knowledge being useless when it really matters. "It's strange," he continued. "I always thought fear was a sign of weakness, something to be eliminated or controlled. But tonight I'm discovering that maybe it's just honesty about our real situation. Maybe that's why I've always avoided situations where I couldn't control the outcome." Emily turned slightly to look at him in the darkness, seeing only the outline of his profile, illuminated by the faint starlight. "Control is an illusion," she said softly. "Life can change completely in a second, as it just did for us. The only thing we really control is how we react to what happens to us. That's a very mature perspective for someone so young, he observed. There was something affectionate in the way he said it. Not condescending, but genuinely admiring. I learned early on that I couldn't control the fact that my father abandoned our family, or that my mother had to work 3 jobs to raise me. But I could control how I reacted to those circumstances, whether I would let them define me negatively or use them as motivation to build something better. They continued talking in whispers, sharing memories, fears, and dreams in a way that had never happened in the formal office environment. Alexander spoke of the pressure of taking over the family business so young, of the impossible expectations, and the loneliness that came with positions of power. Emily shared her insecurities about coming from a small town to the big city, about imposter syndrome, and about dreams that sometimes seemed too big for her circumstances. As the hours passed, she realized she was getting to know not the ruthless tycoon, but the man behind the professional persona, someone who also doubted himself, who also carried emotional scars, who also longed for genuine connection in a world that often valued appearances over authenticity. When they finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, they were holding each other, not with romantic pretensions, but just as 2 vulnerable human beings offering each other comfort in extraordinary circumstances. But even asleep, Emily was aware of his proximity, of the warmth radiating from him, of the way he breathed slowly and deeply, of the fact that for the first time since she had known him, he seemed completely relaxed, without the constant tension he carried in the business world. And some part of her never wanted that moment of innocent intimacy to end. Not because she wanted something inappropriate, but because it was the first time she felt completely safe and understood by someone in the morning when they woke up with the first rays of sun filtering through the leaves of the shelter. There was a moment of mutual awkwardness as they realized how they had slept intertwined, but it was quickly replaced by the urgent reality of their situation. They needed to find more food check for signs of rescue on the horizon, and figure out how to signal their presence if any vessel passed by during their makeshift breakfast of wild berries and rock water. They both avoided mentioning the intimacy of the previous night, but there was a subtle change between them, a new ease that hadn't existed before, as if they had crossed some invisible barrier. "How did you sleep?" Alexander asked, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Better than I expected, considering the circumstances," Emily replied, trying not to think about how attractive he looked. "Even unkempt, you too." "It was better than I imagined," he admitted. "I haven't slept so deeply in a long time." I guess extreme exhaustion trumps any physical discomfort. They spent the morning exploring the island more systematically. Looking for any resources they might have missed the day before, they found more fruit. A small freshwater pond fed by a natural spring, and what looked like the remains of an old fire, suggesting that other people had been on the island at some point. "This is hopeful," Emily observed, examining the old ashes. "It means fishermen or other people know about this place. They might come back. It means it's possible to survive here long enough to be found." Alexander nodded, but she could see the worry in his eyes. It also means a long time might pass between visits. He didn't say it out loud, but they both understood the implication. They could be here for weeks or even months until someone happened to show up for the rest of the day. They worked together, improving the shelter, gathering more firewood for a fire, and organizing their few resources. The dynamic between them had definitely changed. Alexander no longer tried to make decisions unilaterally. Instead, he consulted Emily on every plan, asking for her opinion and seriously considering her suggestions. She, in turn, felt more comfortable offering ideas and even disagreeing with him when she thought there was a better approach. It was a true partnership born of necessity, but one that felt natural to both of them. "You're different today," she observed, as he helped her arrange stones in a circle for the fire. Different. How less controlling? She replied, honestly, more collaborative, as if you've discovered you don't have to have all the answers by yourself. He stopped working and looked at her thoughtfully, maybe. Because for the first time in my adult life, I'm in a situation where I literally don't have the answers, he said slowly. It's simultaneously terrifying and liberating, not having to be the expert all the time, being able to admit ignorance and ask for help without it being seen as weakness. It's not weakness, Emily said firmly. It's intelligence, recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and being willing to learn. As the sun set on the second day, painting the sky with spectacular shades of orange, pink, and purple, they sat on the beach, watching the horizon for any sign of boats. The view was breathtaking, but also a constant reminder of their solitude in the vast ocean. "Do you regret coming with me on this trip?" Alexander asked, suddenly breaking the contemplative silence. "No," Emily replied, without hesitation. "Even with everything that's happened, I don't regret it because this is real." He looked at her confused. Real in a way my life before wasn't. She gestured around the island in the office. Everything was about impressions and hierarchies, maintaining appropriate distances here. We're just two people trying to survive together. It's more honest, more human, somehow. She turned to look at him directly. And I'm getting to know the real you, not just the powerful boss, but the real person underneath all that authority. And what is this person you're discovering, like more vulnerable than I expected? Kinder, more willing to admit uncertainty. She smiled, and much more interesting than the man I met in the job interview. That man was impressive, but this man is real. The words hung between them, laden with meaning that neither was ready to fully explore. They were treading on dangerous ground, where genuine feelings could complicate an already complex situation. But there was also something inevitable about the connection that was growing between them. "When you hired me," Emily asked, "did you expect our professional relationship to develop this way?" "Obviously not." Chuckled softly. "But maybe I should have extreme situations, have a way of revealing who people really are. And you're revealing yourself to be very different from what I initially imagined different. How more courageous, more resilient, wiser than your 24 years would suggest. And also," he hesitated, as if about to say something he shouldn't. "More attractive in a way that goes far beyond physical appearance." The confession hung in the air between them like a dangerous spark. Emily felt her face grow warm, realizing she had revealed more than she intended. But when she looked at Alexander, she saw that he didn't look surprised or uncomfortable, just intensely focused on her. "You find me attractive?" he asked, and there was no arrogance in the question, just genuine curiosity, as if the answer was important for something he was trying to understand about himself. "Yes," she admitted, "because it would be dishonest to deny the obvious. But not just physically as a person who you are when you let your defenses down." He leaned slightly closer. "No one has ever told me that before, that I was more attractive, vulnerable than powerful. It's usually the other way around. Maybe because you've never allowed anyone to see you vulnerable," she suggested. "Or maybe because the people around you are more interested in impressing you than in really getting to know you here. I have nothing to impress anyone with. I have no power or money to offer. I can only be myself. And apparently that's enough for you, more than enough," Emily said softly. And then before she could censor herself, she added, "You're the most fascinating man I've ever met." The impact of the words was immediate. Alexander studied her, as if trying to memorize every detail of her face. "Fascinating," he repeated, as if testing how the word sounded. "Do you really think that? Or is it the isolation making you see things that aren't there?" "I really think that," she replied with conviction. "The isolation has only removed the distractions that prevented me from seeing clearly who you really are. Underneath all that corporate authority, you're kind, intelligent, funny, when you let yourself be, and surprisingly humble for someone with so much success. And you," he said, his voice growing lower, more intimate, "are the bravest woman I've ever met. smarter than any executive I've ever worked with, and more beautiful with each passing day, as if being here is revealing something special that was always there, waiting to be discovered. They were leaning towards each other, almost without realizing it, the distance between them gradually decreasing, until Emily could see the golden flecks in his brown eyes count each dark eyelash that framed his intense gaze. She knew she should pull back, maintain a professional distance, remember that he was her boss, that when they were rescued, they would return to completely different worlds. But here at the hidden lagoon, with the sun filtering through the leaves, creating dancing patterns of light on the water, none of that seemed to matter here. They were just two people who had found something unexpected and precious in each other. Alexander slowly raised his hand, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But instead, Emily leaned into the touch when his fingers gently traced the line of her cheek. She felt as if every nerve ending was on fire. "We shouldn't," he murmured, but his hand didn't move away. "Why not?" she asked. "Because when we get out of here." He paused, struggling with the words. "Because everything will change. We'll go back to being boss and employee, and what's happening between us will be complicated and impossible. What if we don't want to go back to just being boss and employee? What if we want to find out what this could become in the real world?" The question hung between them, laden with possibilities and dangers. Alexander studied her intensely, as if trying to read her soul. "Do you understand what you're suggesting, the complications this would create?" "Yes, I do," she said, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed. "But I also understand that what's happening between us is too real to ignore, and too rare to waste because of social conventions. I've never felt this way about anyone before me, neither." He confessed, his forehead now touching hers. "You're making me want things I swore I'd never want again. You're making me believe that maybe I can have more out of life than just work and loneliness. So maybe we should stop fighting it," she whispered. "Maybe we should see where this takes us." He was about to kiss her when the sound of a distant engine cut through the air like a blade. They quickly pulled apart, looking up at the sky, but it wasn't a helicopter. It was a fishing boat passing far from the coast. They ran to the beach, waving frantically, shouting until they were hoarse, but the vessel was too far away, and soon disappeared behind a rocky peninsula, leaving only the sound of the waves and their own hearts pounding from the shock and adrenaline. "We were almost rescued," Emily said, trying to decide if she was relieved or disappointed almost, Alexander replied. And there was definite disappointment in his voice, as if he too wasn't ready to leave this isolated world where normal rules didn't apply, where they could explore the feelings growing between them without external pressures. They returned to the lagoon, but the moment was broken. The reality of eventual rescue had intruded, reminding them of their real lives' responsibilities and the complications that awaited them as the day wore on. They both grew quieter, lost in thought about what had almost happened and what it would mean when they were found over their dinner of fruit and water. They carefully avoided the topic, but the tension was palpable like live electrical wires when they prepared for sleep on the third night. The proximity needed to conserve heat felt both natural and charged with a sexual tension. Neither knew how to navigate. They lay side by side, but this time there was a sharp awareness of every point of contact, of every shared breath, of the fact that only a few hours earlier they had almost kissed Emily. Closed her eyes, trying to ignore how her body reacted to his closeness, how every fiber of her being wanted to turn and snuggle against him completely. Alexander was also obviously struggling with the same tension. His breathing was irregular too, controlled to be natural, and she could feel the tension in his muscles as if he were forcing himself to stay still. "Emily," he whispered finally, "we're playing with fire." "I know," she replied, but couldn't bring herself to move away if something happens between us, he continued. It won't just be a fling or a release of tension for me. It will be real. It will mean something. I know. She turned to look at him in the intimate darkness of the shelter. For me, too. It would mean something. What exactly, she asked, wanting to hear him verbalize what they were both feeling but were afraid to admit that I'm falling in love with you, he confessed. And the words hung between them like a bridge that once crossed would allow no return, that every day here with you is showing me a version of life I didn't even know I wanted, a version where I can be vulnerable and still strong, where I can admit fears without losing respect, where I can laugh genuinely and dream of futures that include more than just financial success. Emily felt her heart race, because he was putting into words exactly what she had been feeling, but hadn't dared to name. I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion and vulnerability. You're showing me that I can be loved for who I am, not for what I can offer or represent. You're making me feel valuable in a way I've never felt before, as if I'm enough exactly as I am. They stared at each other in the darkness, both understanding that they had crossed an irreversible line, that they had admitted feelings that would make it impossible to pretend they were just a boss and an employee when they returned to civilization. So what do we do now? She asked. Because we can't undo what we've just admitted. We don't want to undo it, he replied, pulling her gently closer until she was nestled against his chest, his heart beating strongly against her ear. We want to find out where this takes us. We want to be brave enough to fight for what we've found here, even when the world tries to convince us it's impossible or inappropriate. They spent the rest of the night awake, talking in whispers about fears, hopes, and possibilities, planning how they could navigate the complications that awaited them. When they finally fell asleep in the early hours of the morning, they were completely intertwined, no longer fighting the proximity or worrying about social propriety. They had found something precious in each other and were determined to protect that discovery against any obstacle the real world might present. For the first time since the crash, Emily slept completely at peace, knowing that no matter what happened when they were rescued, she had found something worth any fight: true love, with a man who saw and valued her for exactly who she was. The fourth day dawned differently from the previous ones. Emily woke up in Alexander's arms for the first time, without any awkwardness or hesitation about their intimacy during the night. They had crossed an emotional barrier that made physical closeness not just acceptable, but necessary. When she opened her eyes, he was already awake, watching her with an expression that mixed tenderness, admiration, and something deeper that made her heart race. "Good morning, my love," he murmured, and the words sounded so natural they could have been said 1,000 times before. "Good morning," she replied, smiling and snuggling closer against his chest. Not wanting the perfect moment to end, they stayed like that for a long time, simply enjoying the feeling of being completely connected without any rush or external pressure. The sun filtered through the leaves of the shelter, creating golden patterns on their skin. And for the first time since the crash, Emily didn't immediately think of rescue or survival. She only thought about how perfect it was to be there with him, as if they had found the place where they belonged in the world. "You know, this changes everything," Alexander said, tracing lazy circles on her arm, admitting, "We're falling in love means we can no longer pretend this is just circumstantial." "I don't want to pretend," she replied honestly. "I want to explore this. I want to see where it takes us, even knowing it will be complicated, especially knowing it will be complicated. The best things in life are usually the hardest to achieve." Kissed the top of her head gently. "When we get out of here, I'm going to resign from my position at the company." The words caught her completely off guard, making her pull back to look at him directly. "What? Why would you do that?" "Because I can't be your boss and your boyfriend at the same time," he explained calmly. It wouldn't be fair to you, not professionally or personally. You deserve a relationship where there's no power imbalance, where your accomplishments are recognized on their own merit, not questioned because of our personal connection. But the company is your life. You built all of this. I'm not abandoning the business, just stepping away from the day-to-day management, letting other executives take over, while I focus on new projects. Maybe something we can build together if you want, he smiled. A smaller, more personal company, where I can use my experience without sacrificing our relationship, Alexander. This is crazy, Emily protested. You can't throw away an empire for me. I'm not throwing anything away, he replied firmly. I'm choosing a real life over an empty existence. I'm choosing love over loneliness. I'm choosing you over everything else because I finally understand that success without someone to share it with means nothing. Tears began to stream down her face because no one had ever made such a sacrifice for her. No one had ever considered her valuable enough to change an entire life for. Are you absolutely sure? She asked. Because once we make this decision, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, he replied gently, wiping away her tears. On this island, I discovered who I really am, when all the external pressures are removed, and that person wants to build a life with you no matter what it costs. They kissed for the first time, and it was unlike any kiss Emily had ever experienced. It wasn't just passion or physical attraction. It was a promise, a commitment, the seal of a decision that would change both their lives forever. His lips were soft, yet firm, demanding, yet gentle. When his tongue met hers, it was as if an electrical circuit completed, sending waves of pleasure and recognition through her entire body when they broke apart. They were both breathless. I love you, he whispered against her lips, and the words came out as both a confession and a promise. I love you too, she replied, and it felt like she was jumping off a cliff, trusting him to catch her at the bottom. The rest of the morning passed in a happy haze. They made plans, talked about the future, laughed at how their families would react to the news, dreamed of possibilities that seemed endless now that they had decided to fight for what they had found. Alexander talked about introducing her to New York high society, about facing judgment and prejudice, about how he didn't care about others' opinions as long as he had her by his side. Emily shared her insecurities about belonging in his world, her worries about being seen as a gold digger or inadequate, but also her determination to prove she was more than enough. Around noon, as they were gathering fruit for lunch, they heard the sound of an engine again, this time much closer. They ran to the beach and saw a fishing boat approaching the shore. 3 fishermen waved back when they saw their desperate signals. Help, they shouted in unison. They had been seen, finally. They would be rescued. As the boat drew near, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and melancholy. Relief, because they were finally returning to civilization. Melancholy, because this isolated period where only the 2 of them existed was coming to an end. The fishermen were kind, offering water, food, and dry clothes as they sailed back to the mainland. During the 2-hour journey, Alexander kept Emily close, whispering reassurances that nothing would change between them, despite returning to the real world, that this was just the beginning, not the end of their story. When they arrived at a small port in Montauk, a small crowd was waiting for them. Paramedics, reporters, curious, onlookers. The questions came like a machine gun burst. What was the experience on the island? Like, are you injured? How did you survive? Is there a romantic relationship between you? Alexander answered the practical questions about survival. But when it came to the personal ones, he simply said they needed privacy to process the experience on the way back to the city in the rescue helicopter that had been dispatched as soon as they were found. They held hands in silence, both processing how drastically their lives had changed in just 4 days when they landed at the heliport. The reality hit them completely. Cars waiting, assistants with piles of urgent documents, phones ringing incessantly, the business world reclaiming Alexander, But this time he didn't let himself be consumed after checking only the most urgent matters. He dismissed everyone and took Emily to his apartment where they could talk without interruption about their next steps over dinner in his penthouse overlooking the city. They finalized the plans that they had started on the island tomorrow. He would announce his resignation from the daily management of the company, promoting trusted executives to take over his responsibilities within a month. They would launch their own consulting firm focused on sustainable development, an area that had always interested him, but he'd never had time to explore. Emily would be his equal partner, not just romantically, but professionally as well. They would face the challenges of building something new together while navigating a relationship that would surely be scrutinized by the media and society. But they were ready for it, because they had discovered on the island that together they were stronger than any external adversity. 3 months later, their new firm, Sterling Carter Consulting, was thriving. Combining Alexander's business expertise with Emily's analytical skills and fresh perspective, the media had eventually lost interest in the island romance story, focusing on new scandals and celebrities, but the changes in their lives were permanent. Alexander had discovered he could be successful in business without sacrificing his personal life. Emily had proven she deserved professional respect, regardless of her background or romantic relationship. They moved into a house in the Hamptons with an ocean view, a constant reminder of where they had found true love. 6 months after the crash, Alexander proposed to her on the same beach where they had been rescued. Not with an elaborate party or an expensive ring, but with the simplicity and sincerity that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Will you marry me?" he asked, kneeling on the sand where it all began. "I'll be your partner in everything," she replied, laughing and crying at the same time, in life, in business, in adventures, and especially in the love we found in the most unlikely place. The wedding was small, intimate, held in the garden of their home, with only close family and true friends. Helen, Emily's mother, cried, with happiness seeing her daughter so radiant and fulfilled. Alexander's few friends, who knew the real man behind the businessman, genuinely celebrated his happiness during their vows. They promised each other they would always remember the lessons learned on the island about what truly mattered in life, about the courage to be vulnerable, about the value of a true partnership. 2 years later, when Emily gave birth to their first child, a girl they named Sophia, in honor of the wisdom they had found through hardship, Alexander held the baby in his arms and murmured, "She'll never know her parents fell in love on a deserted island, but we hope she learns the same lessons about true love and the courage to fight for what matters," as she watched her family. Emily reflected on how a terrible accident had turned into the greatest blessing of her life. If this story touched your heart, if you felt that lump in your throat and tears in your eyes, know that we share that same sensitivity. Every day I bring you real stories that remind us of the value of small things, of the unexpected encounters that change destinies, and of the miracles that happen when we open our hearts here. We don't just tell stories of businessmen and employees, we tell your story, my story, the story of all of us who have ever felt lost or misunderstood at some point. If you believe that every life deserves to be seen, that every heart deserves to be heard, join our family. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. It's not just a channel you're following. It's a refuge for your soul on difficult days, a reminder that you are never alone in your struggles. I promise to bring you stories week after week that will restore your faith in humanity, and maybe even inspire you to write your own story of overcoming. We're in this journey together, and I can't wait to see you in the comments of the next video, because when a young woman from the Midwest accepts a job working for a successful businessman, she doesn't imagine that a helicopter crash would change everything, transforming a professional relationship into the greatest love of their lives, proving that sometimes we need to get completely lost to discover exactly where we belong.